As we continue our look at 50 horror classics, things start to get a little gory and we start time jumping a bit. We kick off with the surprisingly compelling Killer Shrews. A boat captain by the name of Thorne and his trusted skipper land on a secluded island in the Caribbean to drop off supplies. Unfortunately, they can't simply leave once the supplies are offloaded because a hurricane's coming. And so they have to hunker down with the island's meager population. A Swiss doctor, his daughter, and the doctor's two assistants. A guy I'm calling Goggles because of his glasses, and the ex-fiancé of the daughter, who has a bit of a drinking problem. And also a Spaniard who takes care of the horses. Sorry about my nose. All this talking gets me congested. Unfortunately, the denizens of the island are a little tight-lipped about why it's dangerous to go outside at night and why the hurricane is such a big deal. As it turns out, the doctor is performing an experiment on overpopulation and consumption, and he's using shrews that have been genetically modified so he can rapidly study what happens when they eat all the food and turn to cannibalism. Now, shrews already have to eat many times their body weight in order to survive. And that's just normal shrews. This modern-day Frankenstein has grown the shrews to the size of German shepherds. And these creatures are very well made. The visual effects team dolls up some dogs with really creepy looking faces and very realistic looking fangs. And in one scene, there's a jump scare that actually got me. Anyway, the reason the guy with the drinking problem is now the daughter's ex is because when they were attacked, he knocked her over trying to get into the barricaded house, nearly costing her her life. And things go from bad to worse when, after an attack that leaves the Spaniard wounded, but not apparently dead, and yet he is dead, they find out that he's been poisoned. The mutant shrews, they assimilated a poison that was supposed to kill them. So now they're aggressive because they're hungry. There's like 300 of them. And they're now poisonous, or at least some of them are. Now, the drunkard is belligerent and cowardly. And that proves his undoing when, in the big climax of the film, he tries to stay on the roof of the now compromised house because it's made of adobe and plaster, and the hurricane knocks some of the plaster loose, allowing the burrowing shrews to burrow through the dirt adobe. Anyway, he tries to stay on the roof for a while, but then when the rest of the party leaves, he decides to make a break for it and ends up getting killed. Now, earlier in the film, sadly, the skipper gets killed as well. But he at least didn't see it coming. and it hits the Captain Thorne very hard. But he finds solace in learning about the shrews and formulating an escape plan with the daughter, who takes a shine to him. Unfortunately, there are other casualties. The assistant, Goggles, he gets bitten by one of the shrews during the jump scare, and he goes so far as to write out his symptoms as he's dying. He's that dedicated. Meanwhile, with the house compromised and the horses long dead, the group have to make their escape because they don't have enough ammo to kill the remaining almost 300 shrews. And nature will do it for them, they just have to survive. So they take some old oil drums and fashion them into a sort of walking tank and successfully get to the beach where, thankfully, the captain's boat is still floating. And they swim for it, make it to the boat, and muse over the fact that soon there will be only one shrew left on the island, and it'll die of starvation. But the captain and the daughter decide to focus on each other, having fallen in love over the course of a couple of days. Yeah, it's that kind of movie. Anyway, Killer Shrews was a really surprisingly good film. The drunkard, he's as despicable as he is cowardly. And it's because he got drunk earlier in the film that allowed one of the shrews to get in when one of the storm shutters was compromised by the hurricane. And his cowardice rightly is his undoing. If he had only traveled with the group, maybe he would have survived. The doctor's obsession with his study, it proves once again the hubris of the obsessed scientist, and the burgeoning love story between the captain and the daughter are also worth checking out because the actors do such a pretty good job. The extras who buy it, they're also compelling, even though they don't get much screen time. And one guy doesn't even speak English throughout the film. But you do care for these characters. That's why it's so horrific when you see him off-screened to death. But enough of that. Let's move on. The Brain That Wouldn't Die, also called The Head That Wouldn't Die. It's about this surgeon who, despite his father's apprehension, is trying to pioneer a new type of limb transplant. He even does a controversial heart-brain stimulation maneuver that seemingly saves a dying man, but may have cost the guy his consciousness, may have left him a vegetable. We don't see him anymore, so we don't know what becomes of him. Meanwhile, he gets a call from his assistant up at this secluded family house that troubles him. So he takes his girlfriend, who's curious about everything, to the cabin. Unfortunately, he gets a case of leadfoot on a winding road because he's worried about what's happening at the house. And this causes a horrific accident that leaves him relatively unscathed, but leaves his girlfriend headless. Her body burns up in the wrecked car, but he salvages her head and despite his assistant's apprehension. Yeah, you're going to hear a lot of apprehension in this review. Uses chemicals that he's synthesized, along with some preserved blood, to keep her head alive long enough for him to find a replacement body. Now, they're actually researching and developing the idea of a full head transplant right now in the 21st century. But back then it was very controversial. They just didn't have the technology, and even back then in, let's see, what was it? 1962, when the film was set, even limb reattachment and organ transplant was still in its infancy. And the evidence is clear when the assistant reveals that he used to be a surgeon, only for him to sustain an injury which left him missing his left arm. Now, our surgeon did reattach it. Unfortunately, he used a less developed serum, which caused a slow partial rejection of the limb. So it's pretty much useless to the guy, except as an ugly bit of costume jewelry. Meanwhile, the two guys apparently decided to see what they could do with a patchwork of various limbs and organs and other body parts. And they ended up creating a Frankensteinian monstrosity which is kept behind a locked door till the very end of the film. Now, the chemical that keeps the girlfriend's head alive is a little more advanced, and it stimulates parts of her brain in ways that were unforeseen. She seems to develop a connection and control over the monstrosity in the closet, which she orders to kill the assistant, ripping his one good arm right out of its socket, and in a really gory fashion, which I'm sure would be even gorier in color. Yes, they colorized this movie eventually, but I just watched the black and white version. The poor guy stumbles around, bleeding to death, and eventually collapses in the main laboratory. Meanwhile, the surgeon has been searching for a body to replace the one that was destroyed. First he goes to a burlesque house and checks out a couple of lovely ladies who, because he looked at both of them, end up at each other's throats. Then he spots a friend of his walking along and almost gets her, but then another one of her friends shows up asking for a ride. So he's got to scrap that plan. He's got to be no witnesses. And then he finds out about this old college friend of his who used to be a model, but now does private shows only. And we find out why. She was injured, similar to that one woman from a previous review. Her left cheek is partially scarred. And so she's gone into seclusion to use her hair to cover that scar. So she only does body work for creepy photographers. But the surgeon convinces her that he can fix her face with new techniques. So she buys it. Buys the bruise. They go to his place. He drugs her. But thankfully, before he can start the surgery, the girlfriend's head compels the creature behind the closet door to finally break through the door and attack the guy. And this thing looks monstrous, but truly monstrous. It makes all the previous and future Frankenstein monsters look tame by comparison. It looks like Sloth from Goonies was put through a meat grinder. And it kills the surgeon by biting a chunk out of its neck in really gory fashion. Not eating the piece, just spitting it out. The head then compels the creature to carry the drugged woman outside and save them both. And ultimately, after one of the chemicals starts a fire, she allows herself to burn to death along with the assistant and her surgeon ex-boyfriend. And the last we hear is her insane laughter and the film's alternate title, replacing the word brain with the word head. A tragic tale of Beauty and the Beast, in which case both are one and the same. Because from the start, she did not feel like she wanted to be alive. She feels like she was robbed of the grave. And I could see where she's coming from, but honestly, if there was even a 0.000000001% chance I could survive something like that, I'd consider it. Although I'd want a maybe cybernetic body instead of stealing someone else's. But that's just me. I wonder if they could do some sort of remake or reimagining of this movie, because it is a really, really good concept. Heck, they sort of resurrected it in the second X-Files movie. But I digress. Our next film is King of the Zombies. It starts with a trio searching for a general that's been reported as missing over the Haitian archipelago. One of the islands near Haiti, I think. And our film's heroes are Bill, the hero, Mac, the pilot, and Jeff, the black guy comedy relief. And Jeff's portrayal by Manton Moreland is really good. He steals the show. Unfortunately, he has to be stereotypical of the era, because let's face it, it's 1941, and back then, black characters didn't get the dignity they deserved 9 times out of 10. But Moreland runs with it. His character is very Abbott and Costello-ish. In fact, I think Abbott and Costello would have been good as the stars of this particular story. Jeff and Bill play well off of each other. And like I said, Jeff gets his own good material to work with. But anyway, the trio managed to crash land on one of the islands where a radio signal is heard. And unfortunately, the plane's going to need some repairs. Luckily, they stumble across a plantation owned by this Austrian who had to flee his country. Because remember, it's 1941, World War II. And we find out that this guy has a family, a daughter who is worried about her mom, who's been catatonic since they left Austria. There are also several black residents, a creepy butler, an elderly cook lady, who also happens to be a voodoo priestess, a young black woman who takes a shine to Jeff, who reciprocates, and several zombies. But the plantation owner denies that they're even there, even though a couple of them try to attack Jeff. Now, eventually it's revealed that the plantation owner is there to get information on the Panama Canal and what's going on there to influence the war. And he in fact captured the general after tricking him into crash landing on the island as well. And he's tasked the cook lady with using voodoo to get the information out of the guy. Meanwhile, he briefly turns Jeff into a zombie using hypnotism, which he also used to subdue his wife. And thankfully, the young black woman uses a bit of her knowledge of voodoo to snap the guy out of it. And eventually, he gets Mac and Bill to help him investigate and figure out why this guy is doing what he's doing. Unfortunately, off screen, Mac is attacked and zombified. And eventually, because the general's not willing to give up the information, he forces his daughter into a ceremony that will transfer the knowledge from the general to her so she can tell the secrets. Luckily, it's interrupted by Bill and Jeff. And when the guy orders the zombies to attack, Mac included, Bill's connection with his friend is enough to snap the zombies temporarily free of their hold. And so instead they attack the plantation owner, and he burns up in a pit. And so the day is saved. I'm assuming Jeff ends up with the young black woman. The daughter and her mom, who I think was finally snapped out of it thanks to the daughter's study of hypnotism, probably end up going back with Bill. Mac, who was injured in the fight, is going to need some patching up, but he's okay. And probably so are all the rest of the other zombies. And the general calls in aid. And hopefully the island has been liberated from the clutches of the mad hypnotist and the voodoo priestess once and for all. This film was a product of its time, but it had its moments. If you're willing to sort of ignore the cringe factor of some of it, this is actually a solid story. Next is a 1920 silent film starring John Barrymore. That's Drew Barrymore's ancestor, like probably her great-great or great-great-great-grandfather. The Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's a tale as old as time. Are the aspects of the human soul, good and evil, one and the same, or separate entities? Really, this whole good and evil concept is more like the id, ego, and superego. The id and ego, the drive for stuff and the will to claim it, versus the superego, the concept of morality. The id and ego, basically, here's what I want, here's how I get it. And the superego being, here's how I get it without breaking the law. And in this story, Barrymore plays Dr. Jekyll, who, at the urging of his potential future father-in-law, Lord Gregory, decides to engage in a little bit of debauchery. Not serious debauchery, but just a little light hedonism. But he just can't bring himself to do it. He's too much of an uptight wet blanket. And he honestly doesn't want to cheat on his fiancée, Millicent. Even though he gets distracted with his studies and his free clinic, which keeps them apart most days. But then he happens upon an idea. What if you could split the quote-unquote good and evil aspects of yourself so you can indulge one while leaving the other one completely unscathed? It's a perfect plan. So he uses these various chemicals to let his wild side out, and I have to say, the makeup job they did on Mr. Hyde, which is what he calls himself, is amazing. He's like a hobgoblin, but with very little changes to the face. A lot of times, Mr. Hyde is completely unrecognizable from Dr. Jekyll, but here it's a little more subtle. He's like a corrupted version of himself. And so, in order to shore up any potential problems, Dr. Jekyll gets Hyde a place in the slums and sets things up so in the off chance that Jekyll dies, Mr. Hyde will have control of the estate. So either way, Dr. Jekyll / Mr. Hyde is good to go. And so the poor schmuck goes buck wild as Mr. Hyde, engaging in every form of naughtiness under the sun, with the exception of murder. So far. Unfortunately, things go too far when, after Jekyll decides to take a break for a while, and then breaks his streak with yet another night of debauchery, he crosses the line when he knocks over a kid playing in the street and literally steps on the poor kid. And Jekyll's friends become suspicious when Hyde presents the family with a bribe in the form of a check signed Dr. Jekyll. And it's strange that the two are never seen together, just one or the other. Eventually, Lord Gregory, or Sir Gregory, interrogates Jekyll about what's been going on. And Jekyll is like, "You put me in this position. I was fine the way I was until you pushed me into a life of debauchery." And suddenly he spontaneously transforms into Hyde without the aid of the chemical. That change is happening on its own. And so, to avoid getting found out, Hyde clubs Sir Gregory to death. This devastates his daughter, Millicent. Meanwhile, Hyde is like, "Oh, bugger, I've crossed the line." And so he heads back to the slum in order to try and turn back into Dr. Jekyll, which he just barely succeeds. And for a while, again, he swears off. He swears off being Hyde for a while. But eventually that comes back to bite him when he has this hallucination/dream of a giant spider creeping up to attack him in his bed in a really, really good, frightening sequence. And he becomes Hyde once again. Now, at this point, the authorities are called in to try to talk to Dr. Jekyll, but he's nowhere to be seen. And when he's spotted as Hyde, the police give chase, and so does Millicent. Eventually, he tries to get more of the chemicals he needs to turn back into Dr. Jekyll properly. Unfortunately, the city's completely tapped out. I guess that stuff was unobtainium. Anywho, in a moment while he's Dr. Jekyll, Millicent goes to talk to him about her dad. Unfortunately, he's in the process of transforming into Hyde when she comes calling, and so he quickly takes something that he'd sequestered in one of his rings, specifically a ring that he had taken from dancer/prostitute that he had hobnobbed with earlier in the film. This will come back, I promise. Unfortunately, when Millicent is led into the apartment, it's Hyde that does the beckoning. So he menaces Millicent in a really creepy scene. I mean, the expression on his face is like something out of a serial killer documentary. But thankfully, before he does anything undue towards Millicent, he has some sort of attack and dies. Even reverting back to Dr. Jekyll. And we find out what that ring was about and what he took. It was poison. See, the dancer/prostitute told him that it was a relic from back in the day when it was convenient to have a ring full of poison on your person at all time. So, the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde comes to a close with Millicent now having lost both her dad and her boyfriend. Luckily, there are other suitors to help her fill the void. But even though Dr. Jekyll managed to destroy most of his work, there is the possibility that someone might figure out the formula again and unleash another unspeakable horror on the streets of London. Time will tell. And so that brings our current look at the 50 horror classics to a close. When next we meet, we get John Carradine, Bela Lugosi, Judith O'Dea, and the return of Boris Karloff's Detective Long in the next block of horror classics. Until then, this is Mr. J signing out and reminding you, you have to be a complete person in order to live. You can't just split yourself off. And good and evil are points of view. What matters is the choices you make. Make the right choices.